In the last lecture, we saw how the Continental Reformation and the wars of religion fragmented European society. In this lecture, we'll see how events in England, which embarked upon a royal reformation, a magisterial reformation of the Church led by the King and Parliament, which would later sow the seeds of its own religious wars. England was, in fact, one of the most loyal of the provinces of Rome during the Middle Ages. The two archbishoprics of Canterbury and York saw some elements of heretical activity, but very few. The most important was that of John Wycliffe in the 14th century, whose Lollard movement had been suppressed by the Crown itself. The victory of Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII in 1485 after Bosworth Field, was a victory not just of the central government and the restoration of order over society, but also the restoration of order in the Church. Henry was, for a miser, a very pious man who invested heavily in religious institutions. And this vast wealth of monasteries, and not just royal foundations, but foundations that had been founded by a large number of people who wanted to ensure that their way into heaven had been paved with their loyalty and their generosity to the Church. This wealth, though, resulted in luxury and comfort, and these things resulted in ungodly behavior. Moreover, monasteries and convents were still, in England, as everywhere else in the Middle Ages, the dumping grounds for surplus children. And these men and women with no vocation for a religious life got up to some measure of mischief, as they did everywhere. Moreover, the rise of Lutheranism in Germany gave a different model of ecclesiastical behavior, and because of the printing of Lutheran books and the movement of those who had been converted to Lutheranism across the continent, meant that countries like England would be exposed to these new ideas. Moreover, there was the criticism of monasticism, and indeed the criticism of the established church, by men like More and Erasmus, those Christian humanists who sowed the seeds of elements of question. Should, in fact, the church be able to do what it did? Was it, in fact, corrupt? Was it, in fact, fulfilling the obligations that it should have to the community of the faithful? These questions remained, especially in the educated imagination. And then there was anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism was a complicating factor in most churches in Europe, but in England in particular. In part because, like everywhere else, the local lay lords wanted church lands. Church property belonged to the church in perpetuity. It was known as being in mortmain, under the dead hand of the church. So those who wanted to consolidate their estates or acquire wider acres fell into a position where they could only watch and see what they desired so much because it would never be available to them. Moreover, the Babylonian captivity stimulated a certain amount of anti-clericalism and indeed powerful anti-papal feelings in England during the 14th century. This was because there was a belief that the taxes paid from the English church to the papacy, especially curious English-specific taxes like Peter's pence, went to pay French soldiers to fight English soldiers during the 100 Years' War. After all, the Pope was in Avignon, and there was general belief that the papacy was very much an ally of the King of France in this huge conflagration. Although it wasn't true, people believed it, and there were royal attempts to try and restrain the amount of money available going to Rome to ensure that, in fact, it would not go to those places that might actually compromise English victories on the field. There were other elements too. Canon law courts were expensive, and canon law courts were slow. And canon law courts reached into every crevice of English life because not only churchmen and church property were involved, but also anything to do with an oath, anything to do with a will or testament had to be heard in an ecclesiastical court. And those people who had to plead in those courts really resented the expense, resented the time involved, and resented the fact that they couldn't go to their local common law court, which seemed to offer that much better redress. It was during the reign of Henry VIII that this discontent, this subliminal but nevertheless real feeling of discontent with the Roman Church was married to dynastic politics to a very dramatic effect. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509. He himself was a very devout Catholic, and in fact he was a very traditional Catholic who loved the ritual of the Church. And during the first decades of his reign, his chief minister was Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was a cardinal, and Wolsey was Archbishop of York, and so he was not only Lord Chancellor, but he also controlled the church in England largely. So as long as there was this union of crown and altar in the person of Henry and Wolsey, it seemed as though any kind of assault on the church or even major criticism would be met with the most serious of complication. Moreover, Henry hated Lutheranism. As soon as he began to hear of the Lutheran assault on the church, he was appalled. He indeed responded to Luther in the 1521 assertion of the Seven Sacraments. This book, almost certainly written by Thomas More, but one of the advantages of being king is you can sign your name to other people's work, earned him the title of Defensor Fidei, the defender of the faith. And this title remains with the Queen of England to this day, and on British or Canadian coins you can see that FD along with all of the other titles and honors that accrue to the monarch. Henry then was a devout Catholic, believing in the Seven Sacraments, disliking Luther not just for his theological perspective, but also he believed that Lutheranism was socially disruptive, that it would destroy the unity of the kingdom, and so he dealt harshly with those who adopted Lutheran beliefs. However, Henry was in a difficult position. Henry was only the second monarch of a new dynasty, a dynasty that had won the crown at Bosworth by trial by battle. There were many other families with much better claims to the throne, and Henry lacked a male heir. Henry was then in a difficult position. He believed that not only the dynasty was at stake, but also the stability of the kingdom itself. There was not a tradition of female rule in England, and indeed the one time when a woman did inherit the throne, there was civil war in the Middle Ages. But Henry found that he only had a daughter. He was married to his dead brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Now, this is a complicated story, but one worth telling. Henry was actually the second son of Henry VII. He had an older brother with the improbable name of Arthur. Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the unifiers of Spain. And this marriage took place not just for dynastic reasons and to cement an alliance, but also because Catherine carried a very large dowry. However, Arthur died. Arthur died of tuberculosis, probably, before the marriage could produce an heir. And the king, Henry VII, liking the dowry, decided, in fact, not to return it, and the easiest solution was to marry then Arthur's widow, Catherine, to his second son, Henry VIII. This all seemed to be fine, despite the fact the girl was a little bit older, and initially it was a very happy marriage, and it produced a child, but a girl, who would become Mary I. Henry felt that he was not given an heir because, in fact, he was breaking divine law. Increasingly, Henry felt that he was being punished for the sin of incest, that he should not have married his dead brother's widow because of the Levitican injunction against such things. Henry then thought the only solution was to get an annulment, and he began, through Wolsey, to petition the Pope for a divorce. This should not have been difficult, as Wolsey assured Henry, except that European politics intervened. In 1527, the imperial armies of Charles V sacked the city of Rome and took the Pope, Clement VII, virtually as prisoner. And Charles V then controlled the papacy, and Charles was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. The Pope was not going to infuriate Charles by, in effect, saying that your aunt had been living in sin and that your cousin Mary was illegitimate. So no divorce was forthcoming, and Henry then had to deal with the issue himself. Not having the marriage annulled forced Henry to engage in activity that he himself did not find particularly attractive initially, but then realized had possibilities. In 1529, he summoned Parliament to address the problem of the royal marriage, or Henry's great matter as it was known. There was great urgency because Henry's mistress, Anne Boleyn, had become pregnant, and she perhaps was carrying the son that would ensure the solution to Henry's dynastic problems. In 1533, and with the support of Parliament, the new young Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who had spent time in Germany, in fact, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine to be annulled, and the marriage to Anne Boleyn, which had actually already taken place in secret, to be the valid union. The Pope responded the only way the Pope could. He excommunicated Henry. Henry then used this so-called Reformation Parliament. The authority in England of sovereignty is really the king in Parliament, and the English Reformation then was accomplished through legislation, through Act of Parliament. Henry then used the opportunity of the king in Parliament to disestablish the Roman Church through legislation between 1533 and 1535. What this did essentially was to nationalize the Roman Church in England. It transferred the property and the jurisdiction of the church to the crown. And those elements that began to become the clear points of annoyance with the population were immediately addressed. For example, the church was forbidden to make laws without royal approval, to make sure that what happened in England met the political needs and desires of the crown. And secondly, ecclesiastical dues couldn't be paid to Rome. There would never again be an opportunity for anyone to think that English money would be used against England, laundered through the church. And third, Henry was named supreme head of the church in England. In other words, Henry became the Pope in England, and that too is a title enjoyed by the Queen of England today. All subjects, moreover, had to swear an oath. And this oath was designed not just to ensure the succession, because the oath was to bind all English subjects to the succession to the crown of the children of Anne Boleyn and Henry, making Mary, the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, illegitimate. What this means then is that the oath required all subjects to accept what had happened. All subjects had to swear that they accepted the nationalization of the church and the disestablishment of the papacy in England and the authority of the church now residing in the crown. As we saw in a previous lecture, this was something that men like Thomas More and Bishop Fisher of Rochester could not abide, and the result of their opposition took them both to the scaffold. The second significant moment of the Reformation was really the nationalization of the property of the church, beginning with the dissolution of the monasteries. England had vast monastic wealth. It's estimated that up to 10% of the arable land of the country was actually owned by monastic houses. The dissolutions began in 1536, starting with the smaller houses, but then moving to the larger and larger houses until ultimately all the monasteries and convents in the entire kingdom were suppressed. Henry saw this as an advantage, and his new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, manipulated the situation brilliantly. Cromwell had been secretary to Wolsey. He was one of the most intelligent and manipulative of all of the servants that Henry enjoyed, and he also was the one who delivered where no other could. Henry realized that having the wealth of the church at his disposal meant that not only was the crown greatly enriched, and that would allow him to engage in a more active foreign policy, for example, but also he would have a huge treasury to buy the support of the gentry and nobility who may be opposed to his reformation of the church. Those same landlords who wanted ecclesiastical land, that land that previously had been in mortmain, now had an opportunity to secure it, often at very low cost, occasionally at no cost at all, if they supported the crown. And if they received this land or purchased this land, then they became co-conspirators with Henry in the nationalization of the church. So it was a brilliant move and typical of Cromwell's intelligence. And this magisterial reformation then, by 1540, had resulted not just in the complete nationalization of the church, but also by 1540, the suppression of all the monastic houses in the nation. Doctrine began to change also, but very, very slowly. The church under Henry, in fact, remained essentially Catholic, certainly Catholic in appearance. Henry remained a relatively orthodox and devout Catholic, and a man who loved ceremony. He also really believed, I think, that the miracle of the Mass of transubstantiation was true, and so he insisted that transubstantiation remained. He also allowed confession to remain as one of the sacraments, as one of the elements of the Anglican confession, but there were only 3 sacraments: baptism, penance, and the Eucharist. In other words, the 7 sacraments that he had defended so vigorously in 1521 against Luther, he now compromised and would only accept 3, the other 4 passing into history. He also believed that clerks should be celibate. So he insisted on the celibacy of the clergy as well as the role of saints. He did think that saints played a role and they remained in the English church. And this is the way the situation was at Henry's death in 1547. Henry had a tumultuous reign. He had 6 wives, he had 2 children, 2 legitimate children, and he, in effect, had nationalized the church. Henry's death, though, complicated the situation to some extent, because Henry had achieved his goal of a male heir only with his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. The result was that the young Edward VI, as he would be, was only a child when he came to the throne on his father's death. It was necessary then to surround him with counselors and to ensure that he would develop into a godly king and a good king and one that would be worthy of his father's reputation. The interesting phenomenon, though, is that he was surrounded by counselors and personal attendants who were very advanced in the Reformation, who were in many instances Calvinists. And Edward then began to move the Reformation much farther along the Calvinist road that Henry would ever accept. And in fact, Edward himself probably was something of a Calvinist, and most of his advisors were, including some on the bench of bishops. So the English church began to move closer and closer to continental Protestantism. The manifestation of this, and one of the great documents, in fact, of the English language, was the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. This was essentially a Protestant document. It was a liturgy in the English language. It abandoned the Catholic Mass. It abandoned the idea of transubstantiation in exchange for that Calvinist Zwinglian belief that the Eucharist was really a commemoration. The altars were stripped and communion tables put in their place, and England was beginning to appear very, very much then like a continental Protestant kingdom. I say that the document of the Book of Common Prayer was a great document in itself from a literary perspective because it was written by a committee, indicating clearly that great literature can be written by a committee. The rule of Edward VI, though, was short. Edward died in 1553, and there was another problem, another dynastic problem, in fact, one so great there was an attempted coup and a great danger swept the country. Edward was only 16. He'd had tuberculosis during the last years of his life. He never married. He had no heir. And according to the Act of Royal Succession, his heir would be his eldest half-sister, who was Mary. That is, the daughter of Henry VIII by Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic who was angry at the way her mother had been humiliated and very, very desirous of ensuring that England be reunited with Rome. The Protestants around the young king couldn't really accept this. There was an attempt under the Duke of Northumberland to have a coup d'etat. They thought that they could get the dying young king to sign a document that changed the act of succession, and rather than making Mary his heir, would make in fact his young cousin, Jane Grey, who was a noted Protestant, and she too was about 16 years old. To keep the connection very much with the powerful Protestant lords around the king, the Duke of Northumberland then married Jane Grey to his own son, Guilford. This was the 9 days' wonder, the short rule of Lady Jane Grey to try and ensure that there would be a Protestant succession. Of course, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the English people were too committed to the succession as determined by Henry VIII. The idea of changing the succession for the advantage of one family, the Dudleys, the Dukes of Northumberland, was too much, and generally the nation rallied to Mary, for whom there was a great deal of sympathy. First of all, many in England were still Roman Catholics. They didn't quite like what was happening in the church, and they disagreed with the movement towards Calvinism that had happened under Edward VI. Moreover, they saw Mary as a rather sad figure. She had been humiliated as her mother had. She had been left without any supporters. Her religion had been despised. So there was sympathy, and when the nation rallied to her, Jane Grey was imprisoned and Mary was acclaimed queen. The reign of Mary from 1553 was in fact one of the great failures of English history. And this was in part the psychological burden that Mary carried. She was furious with the political classes for having cooperated with the Reformation and the humiliation of her mother. She was furious with England for having embraced the Reformation, for having been almost Calvinist by the time she came to the throne. And she decided that her role was to reconcile the English Church with Rome, to reconcile England with the family of her mother, represented by the royal house of Spain, and an attempt to ensure that England forevermore would remain Catholic. These ambitions and this policy took England into very, very dangerous spheres. She married her own cousin, Philip of Spain, the son of Charles V, in 1554. It was an extraordinarily unpopular union because there was not just distrust of Catholics by many of the political class, there was great dislike of the Spaniards, whom they thought arrogant. Moreover, Philip II of Spain was not a particularly gracious husband. He spent very little time in England and made it quite clear he didn't quite like his wife. But nevertheless, she was very much in love with him, and Philip was adored by the Queen. But nothing came of it. There was no heir, and the people of England became increasingly alienated from not only their own queen, but from the policies that she had put in place. One of the policies that began was the persecution of Protestants, especially their leaders, those who would actually define the English Church under Henry VIII. And of these, old men like Archbishop Cranmer were not only imprisoned, but ultimately they were burned. 300 men and women suffered at the stake, and their biographies written by John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs became popular reading, and the reputation of Mary as Bloody Mary began to enter the collective unconscious in the mythology of England. Moreover, the advantage that England hoped to gain from the marriage with Spain never happened. Had a child been born, that child was supposed to be heir to the Low Countries as well as England, and that would have been a commercial advantage. But there was no child. And so England then found itself, despite the fact that it was clearly excluded in the protocols of the marriage between Philip and Mary, England found herself at war with France for the sake of the Habsburgs. This, of course, was not a particularly good situation, especially since England suffered terribly. And indeed, in 1557, England lost Calais, the last of the great Angevin Empire on the continent. And Mary never forgave herself, and to some extent, history never forgave Mary. Indeed, it was said that her last words were, "When I am dead, cut me open, and you shall find Calais burnt black upon my heart." The death of Mary in 1558, after 5 years of a tumultuous and really failed reign, brought her other half-sister to the throne. That half-sister was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, and it was Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was a very different kind of person from her sister. Elizabeth had survived to the age of 25 by dissembling, by telling Mary that she was willing to become a Catholic while at the same time harboring Protestant beliefs. She surrounded herself with wise men. She was a brilliant manipulator of circumstances and of individuals, and she had the well-being of the kingdom as her primary concern. She also realized when she came to the throne in 1559 that there had to be a settlement of the issue of religion, because when she came to the throne, England was a Catholic country, reunited in communion with Rome, whereas much of the population was Protestant and many of the political class were Protestant. That political class that became extremely fearful under Mary that they would lose the monastic lands that they had gained under Henry. So early in her reign, in 1559, she enacted the Act of Settlement. And the Act of Settlement was, in fact, a brilliant compromise. It was a compromise between the religious conservatives, really Catholics, and there were many of them, and the Calvinists, who wanted to move the church farther and farther along that route to Geneva, and indeed who, soon after in Elizabeth's reign, were given the name of Puritans, that is, those who wanted a pure religion shorn of any of the accretions of the past or any memories of the Catholic Church. The theology then that Elizabeth determined was a theology that really took the image of the church, the liturgy, what you saw when you went to church on Sunday mornings, as essentially the church of Henry VIII. There were bishops, there were altars, there were vestments, and all of these things then reflected Elizabeth's own love of ceremony. But theologically, it maintained some of the elements that Edward VI had introduced in the prayer book. For example, no transubstantiation. Essentially, the liturgy may have been representative of the Catholic memory, but still theologically, it had moved much farther than Henry would ever allow. Moreover, Elizabeth was typical of her age. She believed it was absolutely necessary to have a single religion in the kingdom, because the religion was the glue of her people. It sustained unity. And to be outside the established church was to some extent to be outside of society. And Elizabeth felt that it was necessary for all to conform, at least outwardly. Elizabeth, moreover, was quite open in her allowance for those who had other beliefs to practice them privately, at least at the beginning of her reign. Elizabeth felt that Catholics, as long as they didn't disrupt others, as long as they practiced their Catholicism in private, and as long as they were recognized and admitted to being Catholics, could in fact maintain this religion in their own hearts. She has often been quoted as saying that there is no window to see into men's souls. But this relatively tolerant policy, which I think reflected Elizabeth's own personality, changed. It changed because of a number of events, the most dangerous of which was when Pope Pius V declared Elizabeth to be a heretic and called upon her subjects to rebel against her, and that she was deposed as queen. After this, the hostility towards Catholics began to grow. And moreover, there were many plots, and very dangerous plots, largely orchestrated by Catholics against the person of the Queen and her government, the most dangerous of which circulated around the person of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had fled her northern kingdom and was, in effect, Elizabeth's prisoner. Once these plots were known, and once the position of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis the Queen of England became generally recognized, Elizabeth realized that part of her role was to ensure that she would be able to sustain not just the religion of her people, but also the integrity and the power and the unity of her people. And that meant, to some extent, moving further against the Catholics and others than she herself would have liked. The great threat to her reign was when her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, powerfully encouraged by the Pope, decided that the only solution to England was to invade and was to force the reintegration of England with the Roman Church, the execution of the Queen, and the destruction of the Reformation in that island. The Spanish Armada of 1588, as we know, was defeated. The ships never landed, and England was greater and more powerful, and the Queen more respected as a consequence of that failed invasion. After 1588, England was very secure at home, recognizing the power of its navy and the power of its sailors to protect it in that ocean which served in the service of a wall. And also, England became much more engaged against Catholicism on the continent, sending soldiers and money to the Dutch to fight the Spanish, and also sending support wherever possible to ensure that Spain would never again be able to raise an armada against England. Despite all of these successes, despite the fact that by the end of her reign, Elizabeth was so respected, she was Gloriana, she was the Virgin Queen, she was almost a mythical figure. Despite all of this, the problems that had been growing remained, and in many ways were actually festering. The issue of religion was not solved. The tension between those who wanted a very reformed church, effectively a Calvinist church, and those who wanted an established religion based upon conservative practice with vestments and bishops began to get deeper and began to focus the political classes within the kingdom itself. Next lecture, what we will see is that we will see how these elements would ultimately coalesce and form the nucleus of an anti-royalist position, one that was driven by the force of religion that ultimately would end in regicide and with civil war. destroying not just the stability of the kingdom, but also, in fact, changing the kingdom fundamentally and changing that balance between king and parliament that had been so carefully constructed through the Reformation Acts of Parliament, through the use of royal authority in consultation with bishops in the House of Commons, and also the structure of a kingdom that was very much based upon the person of the king or queen. All of these things evaporated under the power of religion. And all of these things would bring about a terrible series of civil wars that would ultimately result in the complete reconstruction of the relationship between Crown and Parliament.